Good evening, Mr. Berggruen. Let me start to bring some light into your biography to a vast Portuguese audience that might not be completely aware of who you are. So you are 51 years old. You are one of the wealthiest men in the world, with an estimated fortune of $2.3 billion. You have investments in Europe, America, and Asia. You started with real estate, moved into hedge funds and other financial products. You are also in the media. You were at the very beginning of Media Capital with Miguel Paes do Amaral, meaning you have a long-term commitment to Portugal. Now you are also both owners of Leia Publishers here in Portugal, and you are the major single investor on Prisa, the owner of TVI at the moment. So let me make things right. You are my boss.
Well, maybe it's the other way around. I think that anybody who is an investor in any asset, especially a living asset like a media business, at the end of the day, the investor really is there at the service of the business, of the employees of the business, of the management of the business, and certainly the customers. So I'm totally dependent on you. So I'm grateful that we are sitting here with you and that you're here every day doing good things for TVI, for Media Capital, and participating in the very lively and very important media culture of Portugal.
So you are satisfied with your investments here in Portugal?
Well, I must say that TVI and Media Capital has been a great success. And TVI, when Miguel Amaral and I became shareholders, was really a struggling broadcaster. And today, now, for quite a few years, you've been #1, and that's the credit of the creativity, the investments.
It's a team effort here on our part.
It's a great team.
There's an expression that always come associated with you, attached to you, the homeless billionaire, and that's mainly because you don't have your own house. Why did you decide to live like that?
Well, it's a very much a personal choice, so not something that I recommend to others, but it's a question of priority. In my case, at least today, that could change, but I don't have a family, so I'm very free. And a house or an apartment takes, focus, effort, and my focus and effort is much more on things like the institute, the think tank, the governance-focused institute that I'm involved with. It's much more focused on things like the book that's coming out here in Portugal.
We are going to talk about it in a minute.
And other interests. So it's a question of priority. It has little to do with moral or value judgment. It has to do with focus.
Is it another way of saying to everyone that money is not the most important thing, even if you're one of the wealthiest men in the world?
Well, you know, the old expression, money doesn't bring happiness. So I think possessions also don't bring happiness. It's a question of where you want to, you have to make choices in life. Where do you want to focus your resources, your efforts? And in my case, I wanted to focus time and resources, energy to other things. So it's really a choice. And luckily, in most places in the West, we can make certain choices. So I think it really is a great privilege, if one has it, to make those choices.
So you decided to invest your money and your time in international organizations, worried on how governments are doing their business, and ultimately they are using or wasting people's money. That's it. Why is this a key point for you?
Well, my own feeling is that political governance the way people are governed is really maybe the most important factor in people's lives besides culture, besides the environment where they're born. That's probably the biggest determinant. I don't know where you were born personally, but where you were born, let's say in Lisbon, where you grew up, in Lisbon, in Portugal, part of Europe.
Deep inside Portugal country.
Well, you know, that is probably the biggest determinant. Then the environment that you operate in, that you grow up in, the political environment, will also make a huge difference. Portugal was very different when you were born than what it is today. And that has to do very much with the political system, the changes that were huge in Portugal. And today, the opportunities, but the challenges, which are enormous in Portugal because of the crisis of the political union, will, you know, be determinant as to how successful you, but also the next generation, your children, will be. So we think that, you know, these political changes in the political environment is so key that that's where we focus our work as an institute.
Mr. Berggruen, your main point of view in this book, which is presented today here in Portugal and following the same track in a few countries in the world, your main point of view is that we are facing a crisis in Western democracy and economics also. And the East, mainly China, is taking the lead, but they will face major challenges too in the future. So your point is we need to meet halfway, is it?
Well, our thinking is that we've got political crises and governance crises pretty much everywhere around the world of a different nature. In the West, we've got sort of crisis of advanced democracy. In the East, let's say China, they have a crisis. For example, I always think of China as facing a social cliff. So the crisis of China is also a governance crisis, but very different. We in the West have, over time, in our political system, as individuals, earned enormous rights. That's great. At the same time, because we have so much rights, we have the rights to elect or to remove political leaders all the time. That makes the environment very political, very short-term, and it makes it harder for our societies in the West to make the long-term decisions and investments that are needed in a very different world today. Today, the West has real competition, and the competition is obviously from the East. That's
the reason why you state in this book that we no longer live in a true representative democracy, but in what you say is a consumer's democracy. What do you mean by this?
Well, all citizens today, because they can vote at elections every so often, but they can express their views, you know, all the time through media, but the media has changed a lot. It's much more interactive today. These citizens are really political consumers, and in the same way as we lead our lives as consumers, where we, you know, want a lot of short-term benefits and a lot of short-term pleasure, we look at the political process in a fairly short-term way. It's human nature, but we don't want to sacrifice. We want benefits tomorrow, and that's why we call this really a consumer society, as opposed to a, let's say, you know, a normal, longer-term environment.
So, in a certain way, we are living in a world of shadows, of a dysfunctional world, where people, where voters, vote for their political leaders, and both we and them already know that they are not going to do what we need. Is this right?
Yeah, it's a good description in the sense that to be good long-term, you have to be able to make investments and compromise and take difficult decisions that are not always popular, in the short term.
And you think that that scenario is the same or similar all over the Western countries, or we have different situations in the Northern Europe, Southern Europe, United States? There's an ongoing clash, an improving clash in Europe between the Northern countries and Southern countries at the moment. That kind of democracy crisis is the same all over the Western part of the world?
I think essentially yes, but they're obviously different cultures and they're different economic environments. So you talked about North and South in Europe, and there's no question that you have today a very divisive environment between North and South, because the North have made economic reforms over the last decade that the South didn't do, and the North really are creditors today, and the South are debtors. And that is a, let's say, difficult dynamic in any environment, not just the political environment, but it means that the North will have to finance the South, and the South will have to make certain reforms. That's difficult for both sides. And in an environment where the political structure of Europe is not complete, it's particularly dysfunctional. So one of the
You're talking about the European Union as it is at the moment.
And the European Union, and one of our projects as the Institute, is actually focused on the European Union. The European Union is a concept which is really today half done. It's like a building which is half finished, but every member is already living in the building, but maybe there's no roof. So you have two choices: or you finish the building, which is a political process of integration, or you decide you won't do it, but then you have to move next door and build a new building for everybody. In my mind, Europe was created almost administratively by elites, as opposed to in a democratic way involving citizens. So you really have a disconnect between the two, and that's one of the reasons why we're in this crisis.
In your list, do you include the European welfare system? Do you think it is undermined? It has been presented as a special achievement of mankind, born in Europe. Is it undermined at the moment?
No question. I mean, it is. If you lived for the last generation, on average, probably Europe was the best place in the world, because you had this fantastic social net.
Not anymore.
And today, can society, can different countries in Europe afford this social net in an environment that's much more competitive? The answer is no. Doesn't mean that it has to go away. It just means that it needs to be reformed. These principles of giving opportunities to everybody, to give minimums to everybody, I think those principles can be respected. European nations, notwithstanding the crisis, including Portugal, are rich nations, essentially. So can they afford to do it? Yes, but they cannot afford to do it without reforms. In countries which are shrinking in terms of population, competitive globally, the work and living habits of citizens will have to change. Longer periods of work, more investments, and change of working habits. You can't keep the same benefits without adapting.
It seems you are applying your description perfectly to Portugal, to a big picture of Portugal at the moment. I see you take a closer look, you keep a closer look on how Portugal is doing. Do you have an opinion on how the Portuguese people and the Portuguese government at the moment are dealing with the crisis? Because we are also an example of what you were saying a few minutes ago about the short-term view of some political decisions.
Well, that Portugal is being, I think, compared to others, much more courageous. And the population and the political leaders are willing to take a longer-term view make difficult decisions which are not easy, not popular, but probably necessary. As you talked about the social welfare system, which exists everywhere in Europe, I think in Portugal, the percentage of GDP that was attributable to government, I think went from 48% to 41%. That's an enormous step already. That means the private sector is going to become a bigger and bigger part of the economy. That's necessary in an environment where Portugal needs to be more dynamic and a more active economic participant in the global markets, including Europe. So transferring some of the power, some of the economic dynamism from institutions to the private sector is almost necessary.
And that's the only way out, to get out of the crisis.
Yes, the government...
With pain and with no guarantees of gaining a short-term view.
Well, the government doesn't have more money. They can't get more money. So they cannot do more for citizens. The only people who can do more for citizens is citizens themselves. Creating a more flexible labor environment, as painful as it is, will also create the opportunity for new jobs, for innovation, for startups, which in this environment probably sound very difficult, but human beings are incredibly resilient in reality, and shocks make them even more inventive and more productive. And this is obviously what is happening in Portugal and will happen. Portugal will not disappear. It will adapt. Very difficult. The faster it adapts, the better it will be for everybody, and the better it will be also for the next generation. Portugal will go, in my mind, from being quite uncompetitive in the last 10 years. If it makes these reforms, it will become actually very competitive for the next 10 years. Germany did this 10 years ago. It was painful. The results are very good today. Portugal will be ahead of the others. If it's able to continue these reforms, it will be ahead of the others in Europe in terms of competitivity and productivity in 5 years.
That's a nice wish and message for the end of our conversation. Thank you very much, Mr. Berggruen, for being here today.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I'm committed to Portugal, so I mean, good luck, and I'm impressed with what this country is doing.